of fighting going on of that sort. So, yeah, and corporatism didn't work, and it didn't work anywhere very much as a response to the crisis. And so the left didn't have a good set of ideas. And in that circumstance, the neoliberals were saying, okay, we will get the thing going again. So at that point then, neoliberalism started to be one of the ways in which we were going to revive capital accumulation. And the first place where this was attempted was, as I mentioned, Chile. And Chile was an interesting case, in that when Pinochet took over, he was part of a junta, and some of the other members of the junta, Gustavo Lee in particular, was a Keynesian. And so it was only when Pinochet assumed total power in 1975 that Pinochet could then turn to the business elite and ask them about, well, okay, can we get a different way of doing things? And at that point, it was all the economists who were then at the Catholic University of Santiago, who had been trained here in the economics department of Chicago, but were then were brought into government to do the restructuring that I've already mentioned. And what the Chilean case did was to start to alert people as to exactly what could be done through neoliberalization. And the Chilean economy jump-started very fast and moved very quickly, and it was a very great success story for a few years. And then in 1982, it came crashing down in a financial crisis, huge kind of financial crisis. And after that, the Chileans took a much more pragmatic kind of line, in which they were not fully neoliberals. They were kind of inching their way. Well, you know, there were theoretical neoliberals in the sort of late 1970s, and then they started to be pragmatic ones after 1982. And this, I think, is an important lesson, because the pragmatism of neoliberalization is something I want to get to, as opposed to the theory. There's a big gap between the theoretical apparatus and the pragmatic version that has actually dominated in the world over the last 30 years. But what the Chilean case suggested was that neoliberalization might not work in its pure form. And actually, Thatcher found that out very fast. Thatcher's neoliberalization and her neoliberal reforms did not work very well. She would not have got re-elected in 1983 unless she had been at war with the Malvinas in Argentina. And that was one of the main reasons. It was nationalism that got her re-elected, not the fact that that there was this great success. Reagan's reforms didn't produce a great boom in this country. And in fact, very interestingly, if you look at the boom centers in the 1980s, they were West Germany and Japan, which were not neoliberalizing at all. Neoliberalism was not working, actually, in terms of jump-starting the economy. It was not doing it. It was not doing a good job. And part of the argument I made in the book is right the way down the line, you'll find that neoliberalism has not been very good at capital accumulation. And it's not been good at restoring it. In fact, as soon as you get into some of the dramatic neoliberalization, like Russia or something like that, you find negative rates of growth for several years. You also find what neoliberalization does is to generate financial crises all over the place. The number of financial crises that have occurred since 1980 are enormous. So you've got, so actually there's a real serious problem about whether neoliberalization actually solves the problems of capital accumulation. And at that point, it comes back to another issue of, well, if pure neoliberal theory doesn't work, and of course that's one of the criticisms that Stiglitz makes of the IMF these days, is kind of saying, look, it's a purely neoliberal apparatus, and then, you know, it's not really working. We need something else that really works. But this leads us into thinking about, well, what was the pragmatic version of neoliberalization? And I want to make an argument, and I spend quite a time on this in the book, saying the litmus case, the pioneer case in this was not Chile, it was New York City, and the fiscal crisis of New York City in 1975. And what happened in 1975, and I'm going to go over this extremely briefly, what happened in 1975 is the investment bankers in New York City refused to fund the city's debt. They refused to roll over the debt and forced the city close to bankruptcy. And as they forced the city into bankruptcy, they then put themselves in a position to take over the budget of New York City, first through the Municipal Assistance Control Board and then the Emergency Financial Control Board. And essentially what this meant was that all the tax receipts were no longer under democratic control in New York City. They were under the control of this board, which made decisions on how they were to be allocated and when, leaving the city government to discipline its own municipal labor force. not only to discipline that labor force, but also to start to actually find new sources of revenue. One of the big struggles in 1975 onwards was imposing tuition at CUNY. CUNY was tuition free. And imposing tuition at CUNY was, okay, user fees have to be put in there. You have to pay for it. So this business, I think, was just part of the story of how, in a way, the financial institutions engineered a financial coup against New York City, which was just as effective as the military coup had been in Chile. And that financial coup allowed the investment bankers to restructure the New York economy, and they were backed by the state, and in particular by William Simon, then Secretary of the Treasury under Ford, who gave Ford the advice to, when New York appealed to the federal government for help, there was that famous headline in the news, Ford says to city, drop dead. And so there was a total refusal of the federal government to bail them out, and William Simon went on record as saying, I want New York City to hurt so bad that no other jurisdiction in this country will ever try to do what they've done again. And what they had tried to do, of course, was to build the equivalent of a social democratic state, a welfare state, strong education services, strong public health services, lots of investment, and of course lots of employment in municipal unions and the like, which was partly compensating for the deindustrialization that had set in during the 1960s. So this discipline in New York City was a very crucial element in the situation. But in disciplining New York City, the investment bankers didn't simply walk away from the city, and there's a very simple reason they didn't. They had a lot of property in the city. And the big problem that had occurred in the 1970s was, of course, a property crash, a property market crash, and it'll be interesting to see if we're going to see the same thing in the not-too-distant future. A property market crash, and they were really hurting. A lot of the property owners were really hurting. And this was the time when, for example, they built the World Trade Center, and there it was standing empty, and the only way they could actually fill it with anybody was to put all these state functions in it. So in a sense, the state had to subsidize. So the state assets were going into subsidizing the World Trade Center, because nobody else wanted to be in there, and a lot of surplus office space and all this kind of thing. So one of the things the investment bankers did is ask themselves the question, how can we actually revitalize New York City? And one of the key institutions in this was the Downtown Business Partnership, which set up a whole kind of strategy for marketing the city as a cultural center, marketing it as a place for tourists, but also recentering the place as the center of global financial services. And on that point, they were helped out mightily by the federal government, because in 1973, with the OPEC price rise, masses and masses of petrodollars were assembling over in Saudi Arabia and places like that, and the Saudis didn't know what to do with it. And in 1973, we now know that the US actually threatened to invade Saudi Arabia to occupy the oil wells to bring the price down. They didn't invade the oil wells, but what we do know they did was that the Saudis agreed to put all of their extra petrodollars into the New York financial markets, so that New York could position itself as the arbiter of all of the petrodollars globally, in terms of it became the investment center of a global financial system. So you were rebuilding New York around financial services, legal services, all those kinds of things, rebuilding it as tourism. They came up with this famous, the famous logo, I love New York. That's when this was devised. And there was at the same time